She had exactly 14 minutes. 14 minutes to become someone else. Sandra stood in the narrow bathroom of her Washington, D.C. apartment and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this so many times it had stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like routine. Foundation first. Always foundation first. She pressed it into her left cheekbone with the ball of her ring finger, working it in slow, deliberate circles over the bruise that had bloomed overnight like a dark flower beneath her skin, deep plum at the center, bleeding into sick yellow at the edges. Then concealer. Then powder. She worked fast because the clock on the wall above the mirror was not a suggestion. It was a threat. She buttoned her shirt all the way to the collar. She rolled both sleeves to the wrist and pressed them flat. She looked at herself for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds was all she allowed. Any longer and she would start to see the truth behind the performance, and she could not afford that. Not today. Not any day. She picked up her bag. She walked out the door. The morning air outside hit her like cold water across the face, sharp and immediate, and she exhaled through her nose the way she had trained herself to exhale, slow and controlled, so nothing inside her chest came rising to the surface where someone might see it. The bus was crowded. She stood with her left arm pressed against her side, her fingers curled inside her sleeve, her eyes fixed on the middle distance the way people fix their eyes when they are determined to be invisible inside a crowd. By the time she walked through the employee entrance of Harlow's, the most exclusive private dining establishment in New York City, where a single dinner reservation required a 6-week wait list and a personal referral, she had already finished becoming someone else entirely. She had become Sandra the waitress. Quiet. Precise. Invisible. The kind of woman whose smile arrived before you noticed her face and disappeared before you thought to look twice. She had perfected that woman over 2 years of standing in this kitchen, tying this apron, and carrying plates through a dining room full of people whose net worth she would never reach in 3 lifetimes. She knew every corner of this floor. She knew which guests wanted silence and which ones wanted to perform their wealth at you. She knew which tables tipped generously and which ones left the minimum with the specific satisfaction of people who believed service workers should be grateful for anything at all. What she did not know, what she could not have prepared for, was that on a gray Tuesday morning in October, a man she had never seen before would walk through the front door of Harlow's and change the entire direction of her life without saying a single word. He arrived at 9:04 a.m. 4 men entered before him. Broad, dark-suited, with the particular stillness of men whose entire professional value was their capacity for violence delivered without expression. They swept the room with their eyes the way you sweep a room when you are paid to notice everything that could go wrong. Then he walked in. Caruso. He was tall, lean inside a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for his exact body and no one else's. Dark hair. Clean jaw. A tattoo rising up the left side of his neck in dark geometric ink, disappearing into his collar like a secret the fabric was keeping. His hands, when he unbuttoned his jacket and settled into the chair at table 6, were covered in ink too, across the knuckles, up the wrists, each mark precise and permanent. He did not look at the menu. He already knew what he wanted. Sandra approached table 6 the way she approached every table. Notepad. Half smile. Left arm against her side. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Sandra. Can I start you with still or sparkling water?" He looked up. His eyes were very dark and completely calm and they did not perform anything. They simply looked. At her face. Then, for exactly 1/2 second, at her left sleeve. Then back to her face. "Still," he said. "And whatever the kitchen does best." She wrote it down. She turned to leave. She had taken 3 steps when she heard him speak behind her, low, directed at one of his men, the dining room so silent it carried perfectly across the floor. "She's holding something," he said. Sandra kept walking. Her pen pressed into the notepad until the page dented. If you felt that opening hit different, subscribe right now and ring the bell, because what happens next will stay with you long after this story ends. He came back the next morning. Sandra saw him before his coat was fully through the door, and something in her chest tightened in a way she could not immediately name. Not fear exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that felt uncomfortably like being caught at something she hadn't yet done. He sat at table 6 without being directed there. The host, James, a composed man who had politely refused sitting requests from senators and film directors without blinking, simply walked him to the chair as if it had always belonged to him. Caruso ordered still water and the pan-seared halibut without opening the menu. He ate with the unhurried focus of a man who was never in a rush because he had arranged the world around him to wait. Sandra served him and retreated and spent the next hour finding reasons to stay on the far side of the floor. He left an envelope on the table when he was done. She found it when she cleared his setting. Inside was cash that made her throat tighten and a small card with no name on it. 4 words in clean, precise handwriting. Your water glass emptied. She stood at the prep counter holding that card for longer than she should have. She told herself it was a complaint. She told herself he was exacting and difficult and she should be annoyed. She slipped the card into her apron pocket instead. He came back the 3rd morning. And the 4th. By the 5th day the kitchen had his order memorized, and Priya, who had worked Harlow's longer than anyone on the floor and knew the rhythms of the room the way a musician knows a song they've played 1,000 times, leaned against the service station one afternoon and said without looking at her, "He's always in your section." Sandra shrugged. "He likes the halibut." Priya looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who had seen absolutely everything and was choosing kindness over honesty in this particular moment. She said nothing else. Sandra told herself she wasn't thinking about him on the bus home. She told herself she wasn't thinking about the way his eyes moved to her sleeve before they moved back to her face. She told herself a lot of things on the bus home that fell apart the moment she climbed the stairs to the apartment she shared with Marcus, who was already inside, already in a mood she could read from the angle of his shoulders before she'd even closed the door. She made herself small immediately. Small was the strategy. Small was survival. But that night, lying on her side in the dark with her hand pressed over her ribs and her breathing measured and deliberate, she thought very briefly, against her own careful will, about the fact that Caruso had looked at her like she was someone worth paying attention to. That was the most dangerous thought she'd had in months. On the 6th morning he came alone. One man outside the door. Just him at table 6. And when Sandra brought his water he looked up directly and said, "How long have you worked here?" She paused. 2 years. He nodded. Before that? She told him she had waitressed through college in California, moved to New York for a job that didn't work out, stayed because leaving felt harder than staying. He listened the way almost no one at a table like his had ever listened to her. Completely. Without interruption. Without glancing at his phone or the door or the middle distance that meant they were already composing their next sentence while she was still finishing hers. When she was done he said, "You're exceptional at disappearing." She did not answer that. She excused herself and walked to the kitchen and pressed both hands flat against the cold prep counter and breathed through it, because something about the precision of what he had just said, the accuracy of it, the quiet certainty, made her feel seen in a way that was not comfortable. Being seen was not safe. Being seen had never been safe. She told herself he would stop coming. But something in her chest, something small and stubborn and almost entirely buried, already knew he wouldn't. It happened on a Friday. The dining room was running at full capacity, a private luncheon for a Massachusetts state delegation, 14 guests at the center table, and Sandra was covering the floor nearly alone because Priya had called out and the backup server was 20 minutes late and the kitchen was already backed up on 2 entrees. She was moving fast. Too fast for the kind of careful she usually maintained. Caruso was at table 6, as he had been every morning for 3 weeks now. She had stopped being startled by his presence and started being unsettled by the familiarity of it, the way her body registered him the moment he entered the room before her eyes had even found him, some wordless internal signal she had no name for and no interest in examining. She was carrying a full tray. 7 water glasses, a wine decanter, a bread service. One of the delegation aides pushed his chair back abruptly without looking and caught the edge of her path. The tray tilted. Sandra's right arm swung up hard to compensate and her left arm shot out for balance, and in that one unguarded second, her sleeve rode up 4 inches. Maybe 5. The bruise on the inside of her left forearm was fully visible. Dark green and violet, the precise size and shape of a hand gripped too hard around a smaller wrist. She leveled the tray. She pulled the sleeve down. She set every glass on the correct table with a completely steady hand and a completely neutral expression and did not look at table 6. She could feel him looking at her. She served the water. She poured the wine. She returned to the kitchen and stood at the prep counter and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth in the slow controlled rhythm she had developed over a year of kneading it until her hands stopped trembling at the microscopic level only she ever noticed. She told herself the lighting was dim. She told herself he had been watching his phone. She told herself a great many things that the steadier part of her brain knew were not true. When she walked back out onto the floor, Caruso was eating and looking toward the window and said nothing when she refilled his water and nothing when she brought his check. He folded the receipt into his jacket pocket and left without looking at her, and she felt a relief so immediate and so complete that she was briefly ashamed of it. The relief lasted until she cleared his table. Under the water glass he had left the usual envelope. She opened it in the kitchen. The cash was there. There was no card this time. There was a small square of paper, the kind torn from a personal notepad, and on it in his exact handwriting, 3 words. "You are not alone." Sandra stood holding that paper for a very long time. She did not know what to do with 3 words that precise. She did not know how to put them down. She folded the paper. She pressed it flat between her fingers. She slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, and she wore it home like something fragile she was trying not to break. That night Marcus was in a mood she had no map for. There was no inciting moment. No specific trigger she could have identified and stepped around. That was always the worst kind, the ones that came from nowhere, from nothing, from the ordinary Tuesday evening air of a life she had built too small to survive in. She lay in the dark afterward with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and thought about 3 words on a torn piece of paper and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she had almost stopped believing it existed. The faintest, most dangerous thing. Hope. Across New York City in a high-floor office above Central Park, Caruso sat at his desk and told his man James to run a quiet background check. Not on an associate. Not on a rival. On a waitress named Sandra. James looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then he said nothing and picked up his phone because in 9 years of working for Caruso he had learned that the man never asked for anything without a reason, and the reason was always the most important thing. In the room. The worst morning of Sandra's life arrived without warning on a Wednesday. She would spend a long time afterward trying to identify what had made that particular Wednesday different from all the others. Marcus had not been drinking more than usual. There had been no specific trigger, no argument that escalated in a direction she could have seen and corrected. It was ordinary. That was the thing that finally cracked something in her. The complete, absolute ordinariness of it. She came to work that morning with her foundation applied so thick it felt like a second face and her collar buttoned to the throat and a stillness in her body that was different from her usual careful stillness. This was the stillness of a person who had stopped swimming and was simply letting the current decide. She walked through the employee entrance. Through the kitchen. Out onto the floor. And she almost didn't notice him. Almost. Caruso was at table 6 before the restaurant officially opened. It was 8:50 in the morning. He had never arrived this early before. He had a coffee in front of him and his phone face down on the table, and he was looking directly at the employee entrance when she walked through it, as if he had known the exact moment she would appear. The distance between them was the full length of the dining room. 14 tables. Polished dark floors. Morning light cold and white through the tall windows. And across all of it, his eyes found her face in exactly the way she had spent her entire adult life preventing. She dropped her gaze. She walked toward the service station. He spoke before she reached it. Sandra. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. She stopped moving. He had never used it before. It was on her name tag, small silver letters, but he had never needed it until this exact moment, and something about the way it sounded in his voice, quiet and direct and carrying the full weight of his attention, made it feel less like a word and more like a hand extended in the dark. She turned around slowly. He was standing. He had pushed back from the table and was standing in the center of the empty dining room, and the height of him, the gravity of him, should have felt threatening in a space that large and that quiet. But it didn't. It felt like something placed between her and everything else. A wall. A door. A choice. Come sit down, he said. I have to set up the floor. The restaurant opens in 45 minutes, he said, his voice carrying no argument and leaving room for none. Sandra. Come sit down. She didn't know why she listened. She would ask herself that question for weeks afterward. The truest answer, the one she kept folded inside herself like his three-word note, was simpler and more terrifying than any explanation she could construct. She had been waiting for someone to notice for so long that when someone finally did, her body moved toward it before her mind could raise a single defense. She walked to table 6. She stood at the corner of it. He stood on the other side and looked at her with those dark still eyes and said nothing for a moment that expanded and settled like a room filling with light. Then he said, "Who is he?" Sandra felt her throat close. She kept her expression perfectly neutral. "I don't know what you mean." He nodded slowly. Not in agreement. In confirmation of something he had already decided. "You've been covering it for weeks," he said. "This morning is different. You walked in and you were already somewhere else." He touched the side of his head, gently. "Not tired. Not a bad day. Somewhere else entirely." Sandra's jaw was tight. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in front of anyone in over a year, and she was not going to start in a dining room in front of a man whose last name alone made people step out of his way on the street. "This isn't your business," she said. Her voice came out almost perfectly even. He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment and then said, "No. You're right. It isn't. A beat. I'm making it mine anyway." And something about the complete absence of question in that sentence, the calm, unshakable certainty of a man who had decided something and was simply informing the world of the outcome, cracked the smallest seam open in Sandra's chest. Like the first thin line of light under a door that had been sealed for a year. What he said next, she hadn't expected. Not a demand. Not a command. Simply this: "Let James drive you somewhere safe while I handle the rest." She said no. He listened completely. She said no again. He listened again, without impatience, without pressure, without the specific male energy of a man waiting for her objection to run out of air so he could speak. Then he said, "You can keep saying no and I'll keep asking. Not because your answer doesn't matter. Because you walked in here this morning with your hands shaking and you've had them pressed against your apron since you arrived, and I am not capable of sitting across a room from that and doing nothing." Sandra looked down at her hands. She had not noticed the tremor. It had become so constant, so embedded in the background of her body, that she had stopped registering it as something wrong and started experiencing it as something permanent. She looked up at him. He looked back. And she said, very quietly, "Okay." James drove her north out of New York and into Connecticut through a landscape that was turning amber and copper and deep gold in the October light, and he said almost nothing the entire drive except that there were clothes in the guest room and someone named Rosa would bring dinner at 7, and if she needed anything the number was on the nightstand. Sandra sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city dissolve into countryside and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, that the air around her was not about to do something terrible. The estate was behind iron gates on 4 acres of old-growth trees. The house was stone and wide glass, low and sprawling, warm inside in a way she hadn't anticipated. Dark wool throws on wide chairs. Books on every flat surface in the comfortable disorder of things actually read. The smell of cedar and something baking from somewhere deeper in the house. Rosa, small and 60 and with the complete no-nonsense warmth of a woman who had seen everything and been rattled by almost none of it, showed her to the east wing without ceremony and left a tray with soup and bread and a pot of tea and said simply, "Sleep if you can." Sandra sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time and stared at the wall and tried to understand what was happening. She would learn later, in pieces, over the weeks that followed, the precise nature of what Caruso had arranged in her absence. Marcus had received a visit from James and 2 other men. The conversation had been very brief and very polite and entirely without ambiguity. He had signed a document placing Sandra's name on the lease and every possession inside the apartment. He had left Washington, D.C. within 18 hours. She would never see him again. She slept for 12 hours. She did not dream. She woke to Connecticut morning light coming through curtains that were not hers and birds she couldn't name outside a window she didn't recognize, and she lay completely still in the quiet and felt the specific, unfamiliar sensation of a body that was not bracing for anything. Caruso arrived that evening. He knocked. He waited for her to answer. He came in wearing a dark sweater instead of his suit, and without the structured armor of his jacket he looked younger, still powerful, still precise in everything about him, but human in a way the tailored clothes had previously kept at a distance. He sat in a chair across the room. Far enough that the air between them belonged entirely to her. He had a folder in his hand. He set it on the side table. "Your name is on the lease," he said. "Your things will be at the apartment tomorrow." Sandra stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her steadily, the same way he had looked at her across 14 tables of a dining room the very first morning he walked in, direct and unhurried, like he had already decided she was worth the full weight of his attention and had no plans to revise that. "Because no one should have to build a second face every morning before the world is allowed to see them," he said. He stopped. Pressed his jaw once. "The fact that it took me 3 weeks to say something out loud. That's on me." Sandra felt the seam in her chest open a little further. She looked down at her bare hands in her lap. No apron. No uniform. Nothing to press them against and hide the tremor that was, she realized slowly, no longer there. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "No," he said. "But I want to." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Sandra had a word for. She was not a guest in the way she had first understood it. She was not a charity case or an obligation or a problem being managed. Caruso seemed genuinely uninterested in defining what she was to him, and that ambiguity, instead of frightening her the way ambiguity always had, felt like the most generous thing anyone had ever offered her. He did not come every day. Some evenings he called ahead and asked if she felt like company, and she said yes because she found increasingly that she meant it. Other evenings he arrived to find her on the back porch in a borrowed sweater watching the tree line go dark, and he would sit beside her without speaking, and they would be quiet together in a way she had never experienced quiet before. Not the quiet of containing herself. The quiet of two people who did not need to fill the space between them to feel safe inside it. She called her sister Celeste for the first time in 8 months. The call lasted 4 hours. She sat on the porch steps and cried in the specific way that only arrives when relief and grief travel the same road at the same time and meet in the center of your chest and release everything at once. Caruso was inside while she cried. She could see his shadow through the kitchen window. He had taken Rosa's place at the stove and was attempting with visible concentration and almost endearing seriousness to not ruin the soup. Sandra laughed through her tears. She laughed more than she had expected at the things he did when the suit was put away. He was meticulous and quietly funny and unexpectedly gentle with small things, with the way he marked pages in his books, with the way he set her dinner on the table and sat across from her without making it feel like a performance of kindness. He simply did it, the way he did everything, with complete certainty and no requirement that she notice. But she noticed. She noticed everything. One evening in the 6th week Sandra sat beside him on the porch with her tea going cold in her hands and told him the whole truth. Not the version she had rehearsed in her own head, the one with her dignity still arranged neatly around the edges of the facts. The real version. The one with the 14 minutes every morning and the foundation and the concealer and the 2-second mirror rule and the way she had learned to read Marcus's mood from the angle of his shoulders before she had even fully closed the door. The version with the specific weight of a life lived perpetually small, perpetually quiet, perpetually one careful step to the left of being fully seen by anyone because being seen had taught her early and repeatedly that it was the fastest route to being broken. Caruso listened without speaking. Without shifting. Without any of the subtle physical discomfort people perform when they hear things they don't know how to carry. He simply listened, completely, until the last word had settled into the cold October air between them, and then he was quiet for a moment that felt like the held breath before something true is said. Then he said, "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met." Sandra shook her head. "I spent a year hiding." "You came to work every single day," he said. "You carried every bit of it completely alone. You kept moving when most people would have collapsed under half of what you were holding." He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning across a full dining room, direct and unhurried, like her face was something he had decided a long time ago was worth memorizing properly, and he was taking his time doing it right. "That is not hiding, Sandra. That is surviving. And surviving when everything inside you has stopped believing it's worth it, that is the bravest thing a person can do." She felt her eyes fill. She looked away at the dark tree line and blinked until the feeling moved from her throat back down into her chest where she could breathe around it. After a moment she said, very quietly, "What are we doing, Dante?" He was quiet for 1 beat. 2. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full, the way a room feels full right before someone says the thing that changes it permanently. Then he said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." He said it the way he said everything. No decoration. No performance. No conditional clause protecting him from the weight of it. Just the bare, direct truth of it placed between them like something he had been carrying for a while and had simply decided it was time to set down. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 14 minutes in a fluorescent bathroom with her foundation and her concealer and her 2-second mirror rule. She thought about sleeves pulled to the wrist and collars buttoned to the throat and the specific invisible gravity of a life built around never being fully present in it. She thought about a torn piece of paper with 3 words on it that she had carried against her chest for weeks because she hadn't been able to let it go. "You are not alone," she set her tea down. She reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his tattooed hand, and she felt him go completely still with something rarer and more precise than anything she had seen from him before. Not the stillness of control. The stillness of a man who had just been trusted with something he understood the full value of. "I already did," she said. The words came out steadier than anything she had said in over a year, because they were true, and they were hers, and she was saying them in the open air with her full voice and nothing covering them. He turned his hand under hers and held it. And for a long while neither of them spoke, because some distance is close in a language that has no words. Only warmth. Only presence. Only two people finding each other after a long time of being lost and deciding, without negotiation, to stay found. She had spent more than a year building a second face every morning. Before the world was allowed to see her. 14 minutes. Foundation. Concealer. 2 seconds in the mirror. But sitting here on a Connecticut porch in the amber evening light with the most dangerous man in New York holding her hand like it was the most important thing he had ever been trusted with, she was finished disappearing. She was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, exactly where she was supposed to be. Completely present. Completely seen. Completely hers. If this story moved something in you, and I believe it did, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a Mafia Hidden Tales original. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Sandra was never going to be invisible again? I'll see you in the next tale.